Berkshires and Lee, in a community that I represented for 10 years. And that I grew up the road up in Pittsfield. I don't want to presume anything here, and we'll then talk a little bit about the transportation plan that we're rolling out this week, and then really I'm excited to take questions from you all. So thank you all for taking the time to be here with us. So like I said, my name is Ben Downing. I'm a former state senator from Western Mass, grew up in Pittsfield. I'm a clean energy business leader. I'm a dad to 2 toddler boys, husband to Michaela, the oldest of Jerry and Pam's 4 kids, and these days a proud resident of East Boston. I decided to run for governor because I was tired of watching a governor with all the popularity and a legislature with all the power refuse to use either for us. Meanwhile, the communities that I grew up in, that I represented, that I live in now, saw jobs leave and saw rents rise. Saw trains run off the track where we had them, or not come nearly enough in places that didn't have them. Air clog. We saw childcare wait lists grow longer and longer, and public higher education grow further out of reach. And that was before the pandemic. Too often we saw state leaders care more about protecting their power than about protecting their people. I'm running to be your governor because I believe the future of Massachusetts is limitless, but I know that our time is not. And for too long, the political power in this state has acted like we have a surplus of tomorrows. Like you, I didn't need COVID to show me that that wasn't the case, right? So now I want to start to talk a bit about what I have proposed here, what we will propose in our Transit for All plan. When I was first elected in 2006, first sworn in 2007, I was given the worst office in the state Senate, small cramped office. I won't even talk about what someone had left in some of the desk drawers in that office, but the first report on my desk was a Transportation Finance Commission report. And that Transportation Finance Commission report outlined the shortcomings of transportation policy for the 2 decades before that. It pointed out the fact that our roads, that our bridges, that our transit, whether it was buses or trains, that we hadn't invested in those systems for the better part of a generation. And the scary thing about running right now is that if I handed each and every one of you the D'Alessandro report, the Transportation Finance Commission report that was on my desk in 2007, it would read eerily similar to the status quo. Because while we have made some improvements in some of the state transportation agencies, while we have made some investments in our core infrastructure and prioritized transportation in a way that will allow us to build a system that will make our economy stronger, that will help us solve climate change, and that will build a more just and fair Massachusetts for all 351 cities and towns. That's true here in the Berkshires. It's true in East Boston, in the neighborhood that I've started to raise a family over the last 4 years. So how would we have a transportation policy that would actually go about doing that? What would that look like? First, it would commit to fare-free transit for everyone. Why fare-free transit? We know in the areas that have piloted fare-free transit, so that would mean using the BRTA, using the MBTA, using the Worcester Regional Transit Authority or the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority, using that and not having to pay a fare when you get on the bus. We know that when we do that and rather fund it through taxes or through one-time payments, we know that the ridership of the bus and of transit goes up significantly. We know that ridership is more diverse than it regularly is. We know that ridership directly benefits. We're encouraging the type of behavior that we want, getting people out of cars and into transit, and we're getting higher ridership 100 plus years ago. And we hang on.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
Think the current status quo is a good thing. That every region of the state thinks, well, someone has to be benefiting from this status quo. I know I would hear, as I represented the 52 communities in Western Massachusetts, that, well, we send a penny on our sales tax to Boston for the T, and the T runs far better hours than the BRTA does. They've got it much than us. I know when I ride that T that breaks down, I have had neighbors say to me, we spend too much on roads and bridges in other parts of the state. It ought to all go right here to the T. The truth is, we're just not investing enough in transportation in all 351 cities and towns. One of the reasons why that is, we don't have one of the key tools that almost every other part of the country has, which is regional revenue to meet regional needs. In many other parts of the country, you have a regional either commission or county government that will propose every year a plan for transportation in that region, and then a revenue stream to fund it. If voters support that plan, they move forward with the plan. If voters do not support the plan, those improvements in the operating budget stay as they were the year before. In urban settings and in rural settings, we see significant approval of those plans because people are willing to pay for the improvements they see in their region. And they know when that is controlled locally, they're going to get a regional transportation plan that meets their regional needs. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all statewide solution for our transportation challenges. We know even in a climate-changing world that the transportation answers in Western Mass are going to be different than the transportation answers in and around your Boston. So enable them to put forward voters regional ballot initiatives, and they would be tasked with coming up with a transportation plan for the region and the revenues to fund it. Now, there will still be statewide funding. In fact, we will double the funding to the RTAs. So the BRTA funding would be more stable, more resilient over the long term, and it would be a dedicated revenue source, not one that is dependent on fares, but one they can look at and say, how do we drive up ridership, and how do we play a stronger role in the regional economy? So by doubling funding for the RTAs and by empowering regional transportation commissions, we start to give greater control to regions to shape their transportation future. Along with that, the existing train service in Massachusetts is still too often powered by diesel fuel. We need to be electrifying that system, just like we need to electrify every part of the way we heat our homes in almost every part of our daily lives. So we need to electrify and modernize the commuter rail and regional rail system that we do have, and then expand and commit to expansion of that system like West-East Rail, connecting all the way from Albany to Boston and connecting all of the communities in between, right? And the reason that we do that is not just to connect folks from here in the Berkshires to economic opportunities in Boston, but rather to try to knit the whole state together. I rode the train coming out of South Station today into Worcester, into their Union Station. There was a not insignificant chunk of that ridership that rode the whole way who were living in Boston and going to work in Worcester. Yeah, there are plenty of people who are going to live in Worcester and then go to work in Boston, but we need to find ways to connect the entire state together. And we need to commit to funding those in a way that we can actually plan our communities around. South Coast Rail is finally getting done. That's been talked about for a generation. The Green Line extension is finally getting done. That's been talked about for a generation. We can't wait for a generation to do West-East Rail. That's why in this plan, we would commit to funding West-East Rail by 2030 and getting it done by 2030. It will be a priority of this administration. I think it's key for geographic equity. It's key for building a stronger economy for the state as a whole. And it's also key for taking pressure off of Greater Boston. For too long, we have said that the only economic driver in the state of Massachusetts is the Greater Boston economy. Well, that's not good for the Berkshires. It's not good for the Pioneer Valley. It's not good for Worcester, for the South Coast, for the Merrimack Valley, but it's also not good for Greater Boston. It asks too much of their transportation infrastructure and drives up housing costs and pushes out working folks, right? Out onto the edges that gives them a worse commute coming in to their surrounding areas. So that's part of the reason why we will prioritize West-East Rail along with the electrification of the existing system. So those are some of the key priorities in the transportation plan that we're rolling out, along with prioritizing safe and livable streets so that folks have the opportunity to ride their bikes and to walk in and around their downtowns and in and around their communities. Too often over the last 20 years, the last 30 years, we haven't accounted for pedestrian traffic. We haven't accounted for bike traffic in our downtowns. We need to do so in a way that doesn't come with a scarcity mindset around one-time grants, but allows communities to regularly plan around that. And then in all of this, we need to be thinking about climate. I have said that 80% of the federal stimulus dollars that are coming in need to go to climate solutions, whether that's expansion of transit, whether that's affordable, energy efficient housing, or other solutions of the like. That's how we'll think about every single solution that we move forward in the transportation plan and how we knit in federal resources as well. So with that, that is altogether way too much of me talking. I want to get to the question and answer part of it, but I want to say this. This is one of those issues where Beacon Hill for too long, both Democrats and Republicans have kicked the can. We've continued to kick the can down the road. And what that's led to is a hidden tax on every community. It's the kid who I talked to who couldn't take one of the internships that he was offered at a manufacturing company because the bee didn't run late enough for him to be able to get to that third shift and work. It's a hidden tax that he pays. It's a hidden tax that many of our neighbors pay because they've got to pay the extra fuel costs. They've got to pay the extra costs to keep the car on the road. They've got to pay the extra insurance costs. They've got to pay the extra long drive to connect them to economic opportunity. They've got to pay the extra fares, right? We all pay these extra costs for our leaders kicking the can down the road. We can build a fairer, stronger Massachusetts, and a big part of that is connecting every part of the state through investments in transportation. That's why I've prioritized this plan. And that's why I'm focused on transit, because we do it with an eye towards climate. We do it with an eye towards economic fairness. We do it with an eye towards racial justice. And we do that by prioritizing the investment in transit first. So to that extent, I want to wrap up. I want to say thank you all. I know there's a million things you could be doing. And I know in particular these days, it's tough to think about doing anything. So I appreciate everyone coming out. I look forward to your questions, and please know, and I hope this goes without saying, but this will not be the last time we get a chance to talk. I am happy to meet with anyone whenever possible, and I will be out here regularly. If for no other reason than Nana Pam, my mom, demands that she gets to see her grandsons pretty regularly. But much more importantly than that, this place is home to me in every way possible. And it has been tough for me to be away for the last couple of years working at my other job. But the Berkshires writ large, certainly Pittsfield specifically, but the Berkshires writ large are home to me. And so thank you all for coming out, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. So I look forward to your questions from there. Yeah.
I've been paying attention to this rail trail for many years, and I'm very curious because I'm originally from New York City, and I've been wondering what is going on and why there hasn't been a rail trail. There used to be a bus that came up to Great Barrington from Wasaya.
Yes, that was
New York.
That's one of the great mysteries of transportation. Yeah. It did exist. No one knows exactly why, who kicked it off. I found the man who by Metro, by the MTA in New York, by Metro North.
2.5 hours to drive.
I'm afraid that that's one that I have to say I don't know about that. But the train line here from Pittsfield to the Connecticut border is currently being upgraded at a total cost to the taxpayer of close to $50 million. This was something led by Governor DeVal. And the idea is that was all framed with the idea of passenger service to New York. Connecticut remains in between us and New York. And
The
we're working.
governor didn't want to pay.
We're working down there. We're working down there. Smith, our other representative, Pignatelli came down to Canaan, Connecticut. He crossed. They let him in. They gave him a day pass. And we're working on that. Here's something about Pittsfield. When East-West Rail is running, the Berkshire line is running to New York. Well, the East-West Rail to Albany. Think of how connected we will be. We will not be at the end of the earth, the fringes. We're going to be the center.
Well, is this gonna happen?
So a couple of things on that. One, I think a role that a governor can play on the bus or on others on sort of temporary solutions, right, is there are any number of places where, in particular, the New England governors are working together. They work together on electricity because we're in the ISO New England market. They work together on transportation because there are things that Connecticut wants Massachusetts to upgrade, and we can have those ongoing conversations. And so by prioritizing this, it will give me leverage in our discussions with other states to make sure that if we're going to help fund their priorities, they're going to help fund our priorities as well. But the important thing from my perspective in this plan is by calling out that the line will be complete by 2030, you put down a marker, right? And that's a forcing function on all of us. That is an aggressive schedule. We all know big projects like this do not happen quick. But if you accept, but if you accept the timeline that we're on now, we know we won't get it. So we have to be aggressive about it, and we have to be clear that it's going to be a priority of this initiative.
Didn't the Connecticut governor say no to this?
No, that's much more complicated than that. But what I have learned is that even though they're departments of transportation and legislators, the governors really matter. Governors really, really matter. And they set an agenda. And if you have a governor who simply doesn't care about an issue, doesn't prioritize it, things don't move. But a governor will lead.
We have a question from Zoom, actually. Sure. So, and if you want to say, because you have the mic,
Okay.
but Tom O'Brien has a question.
Sure, we have a question from Tom O'Brien coming in. Tom, can you fire away with your question?
Well, I didn't have one right now, but I'm listening.
well, we appreciate the wave high then, Tom. We appreciate the wave high. Any questions? Marietta. And please, I'm going to keep checking back here, but holler if I miss your hand. All right, Marietta.
So as governor, how quickly can you improve the hours with the BRTA? As a retired counselor, I know I've had students of immigrant heritage. Their parents would love to come here. Transportation is really difficult. They have to work to have a used car, they have to come for it. And those night hours, and those early morning hours are horrendous. And communication with people who depend upon the BRTA and so on is difficult.
Absolutely.
So how soon could you implement this? I love the idea of the fair.
So so repeating the question for folks on Zoom, the question is how quickly could you change the hours, say, at the BRTA? So I think the funding, if we're looking at funding and you're looking at the first budget that you're getting done, I think you could get the budget done by June or July of your first year, right? So then you're talking about implementing that by the end of, in that case, 2023. So it ought to be able to go in place at the very least by the end of that year. Now, I would say this. I think there are certain things that the legislature and administration would want to tell all of the regional transit authorities to prioritize, but I'd also want to give them flexibility because it may well be that at the BRTA, it's the expansion of hours. It could be that at the PVTA, they say the hours are great, but we have 3 lines that we want to fund with that. So I wouldn't want to tie the hands of local regional planners to come up with the right answer. But I think we'd want to say, here are some priorities. Make sure you're expanding hours, make sure you're expanding lines, expand access, whatever that looks like in your area, whatever going to drive up ridership. We want to see more of that. And in particular, we want to benefit folks who would see the greatest benefit from those expansions in hours. So we got, yeah, sure. We got two here, and then we'll come online too. Sure.
I was just trying to black them.
Oh. Watch this, I can block this on foot. It's a twofer. It's a twofer.
So I got in here late, I was working late. So you may have addressed this already, if you have.
Yeah.
The adoption.
Yeah.
So what do you know about it? How do you feel about it?
So I have followed the stories in the press, which I know is a portion of the story. I don't pretend that that alone is the full story. I think, like just about everyone, I wouldn't want the dump in my community. I don't think any of us want the dump, right? I do think that's a universal statement. I want to learn more about what the options are, especially now that we're in litigation before the EPA, that there's been the hearing and figuring out sort of what the options are from there. I have not talked to any of the local officials that negotiated the agreement, and I know there is frustration from some folks about that, but I also haven't heard that side of it either, right? So I have followed it from afar to date, and I have committed to coming and sitting down with folks directly to hear it and have a long meeting on specifically that. So I have not, I don't feel like I have enough to tell me that I am in a position to render a judgment on it yet, right? But I'm more than willing to meet with folks on it.
Okay, so as governor,
Yeah.
you would do the research.
Absolutely, but I'm going to do it before that. I want to do that as a candidate now in the process to make sure I am as informed as possible on that.
We can alternate.
No, we had one other one, so we'll go here and then we'll come to that. Yeah.
Specifically about the railways.
Yeah.
I live here in Lee. My name is Joshua. I'm one of the town reps. We voted at our last town meeting, annual meeting, to advocate as a town that any PCB materials that are dredged from the river would be transported by rail rather than by trucks from the town.
Yep.
As a candidate for governor, I ask you to support our townspeople in that commitment to using the rails, even if it's more expensive to transport that dredged material.
Yeah, you have that commitment. That is and I know the homework on from earlier, so that makes plenty of sense. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, appreciate that.
Okay, so again, if you want to ask Benjamin to.
Sure.
Ask the question.
Hey, Benjamin, looking forward to the question. Squat down.
Thanks. So I wanted to first thank you for your emphasis on transit first, because I think that's a really good kind of first start. And then secondly, the idea of electrifying that. So my question is the usual issue with transit is you see some buses, for example, heavily used in, passing by stops because they've got too many people. And then other routes with a practically empty bus driving around. And that's particularly the case. I'm here in the Pioneer Valley, where PVTA has some routes that will take you 2 hours to get to a location that you could bike to in half an hour, and some routes that that are faster than driving a car. Do you have any thoughts on how to help kind of these regional transit authorities provide kind of a more targeted service?
Yeah, Ben. So the question for folks who might not have heard it here was, how can we help? And Benjamin, feel free to tell me if I don't capture this correctly, but the question was, how can we effectively allow RTAs to have more flexibility or to operate in a more flexible way, especially outside of Greater Boston? The RTAs have maybe 1 or 2 lines that are regularly their heavily most ridden lines. And then as you start to get outside of those lines, you have far lower ridership totals across the board, right? So how can we come up with more flexible options? I think there's a couple of different things that we can do there, right? We can not be as reliant on sort of the single size of buses that we see to date. I think a greater use of a more flexible fleet, and I think we have, try to say that too often, right? A flexible fleet, but one of the ways that we can do that is using vans and smaller ADA accessible vehicles, especially as we're making the transition to electrification of that fleet, right? Because we want to be able to get away from using gas to fund or to run the buses. We want to electrify those as part of the broader climate goals as well. I think that transition is an opportunity to change the makeup of the fleet and to enable a more flexible plan. I also think the regular planning process, Benjamin, is one where if you're regularly going to the voters, there is not only going to be the input of an RTA board meeting, which as much work as they might do to try to make those open, are not sort of the open, inviting process that a broader public debate about how to fund transit and transportation would be. And so I think the regular sort of process of having to present to the voters a budget and the justification for it would enable a discussion around flexibility on the route. So it isn't just a single planning process, but is more of a dynamic process, less of a static process. So I think electrification, greater resources, number one, electrification, number two, and then the regional ballot initiative process, number three, would just lead to more of that debate. But I'll think about that because it's a very good point. Very good point. Appreciate it.
Does anyone have one here? I'm just making sure we're all voting, because there is another one, with Zoom. Ann Miller wrote in, and Karen, this is probably for both of you, that you can speak to. So the detailed NNEIRI plan for East-West Rail was completed in 2016. Why are we looking at 9 years for completion of East-West Rail? The Knowledge Corridor line was built in almost half that time. So I'm like, why are we talking about 2030?
Yes. So I love that spirit. And trust me, if in the homework, and that's part of the policy process in this campaign, and Ann, I'm going to come directly to your question, but part of the policy process is to roll out a policy plan and then have feedback hubs. And I want to hear from people that say, hey, you missed on this. This date's wrong, that funding level's wrong. I don't think your series of priorities here are right. I think you ought to flip 3 and 1, and I think I've got another one that you haven't accounted for, right? We've done that on climate. We're going to do it on the other 2 policy proposals that we rolled out, the anti-poverty plan, the universal child care plan. We're going to do it on transportation as well. I will tell you that I haven't seen the build-out plan of East-West Rail that could do it quicker, but I am open to the idea that we can, knowing full well that in particular, if we're talking about Albany to Boston, right? That not only do we have to get on the easements and all that work and all the permitting work, but we've got to get New York on board on their side of it, even if we're paying for it. So I wanted to be reflective of some of those uncertainties, but you have my commitment that I am not saying that 2030 ought to be the date. I want to get it done far sooner than that. And if in doing my homework or others, we think we can, I'm all for it. Absolutely all for it.
There are a number of proposals that Ann's referring to the NERI plan that was for a somewhat different. It wasn't just east-west. It went up to, it went north, then you know. It went down to New Haven. When I first started working on trains, I met the head of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, and he said, you know, departments of transportation, they love doing studies because they look so nice on the shelf when they're done, especially if the spines are all different colors. And the departments of transportation, they love doing studies because they look nice on the shelf. They do studies, they put them on the shelf. And then maybe some years later, they'll do another one. There have been a number of proposals for improving service on the east-west line where there is a train now. One proposal was from an organization called Transit Matters, said that we could basically start tomorrow. They had worked out a scheme. Amtrak itself has put out a proposal that to use some, Amtrak's getting will be getting a lot of money in the infrastructure bill, to use some of that to almost very quickly improve the service on the existing line from Albany to Boston, which was a kind of a surprise that Amtrak has come out with that. Then there are proposals for, high-speed rail, building it takes longer, requires different, it costs probably at least 100 times as much as putting in high performance. So we're talking some choices that would have to be by our leaders, but in really taking the temperature of and balancing priorities. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. We need to be able to act quickly and satisfy people's needs. So there are some exciting proposals, but definitely I would urge candidate Downing to also realize that there are there's so much work that's been done,
Mhm.
that we can build on, that we can. So I don't think your timetable, I think it's a realistic one.
That might mean we can move it up. I like being aggressive over realistic.
Could I ask a question?
You could elaborate on the use of federal funding,
Yeah.
especially with, there's a lot of money being talked about that
Mhm.
might eventually be floating around and coming in, and having looked at preliminary looks at what those plans are, there's a lot of money that seems like it could have some variable usage
Mhm.
and could be used in innovative ways to actually really help local communities. I was wondering what kind of thinking has already been done there, and maybe a little more elaboration on what the plan is right now.
So repeating for everyone on, so the question from, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Harmon.
The question from Harmon was whether, what have we done with thinking around using the both existing and potential federal resources that are coming in, and what that will look like. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I hope you all caught that, right? So we have, effectively 3 buckets if you think of it. You had the 4, the stimulus funds that have already been passed, the potential bipartisan infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill, which is the 3.5 trillion number that we've heard. And just to be clear on that, because I think there's some confusion there, that is a 10-year commitment, right? So that's 350 billion a year over the course of 10 years. And then even within that, you have the state's sort of one-time existing surplus. All of that is before the Fair Share Amendment or any additional revenue streams. So I think in both the bipartisan infrastructure, in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, in the stimulus bill, and in the potential reconciliation, there are some programmatic allocations for sure, but there is significant flexibility at the state level. That's why I've called for the dedication of 80% to climate solutions and tried to give some flexibility to the existing administration, knowing that there's a lot of work to do around climate, everything from potential seawall hardening to affordable housing, to working on wastewater treatment and flooding, to making the investments in transit that we need to make across the board. I think one of the ways that we could or should think about it are the simplest ways to get the resources out the door. So get the resources directly to your regional transit authorities that have an operating, an increased budget, and go from there. Fund the initial pre-work on any and all transit transit proposals like West East Rail and others that you can get done right now. So I think it's trying to work through the existing structures to get the dollars out the door as quickly as possible is the smartest way. Above and beyond that, I know we haven't yet gone into detail within the plan, but I'd be open to ideas that you might have, Harmon, on how we can specify within that. I also think that as much as we have focused on transit in this plan, there are existing sort of non-transit expenditures that are critically important in communities like Lee and others as well. Road and bridge work that's maybe not a transit expenditure itself, but the bus can't get there if the bridge isn't is structurally deficient, and we know too many of them are. Same with culverts, and we know that especially in small communities, just one culvert project is enough to bankrupt many small communities' road and bridge transportation budgets on the whole. So I have some ideas there. They aren't as fleshed out as I think I'd like them to be, but would love your feedback there, Harmon.
I'll have to keep reading.
Yeah, please do. Thank you. Do we have? Let's go online if we got one, and then we'll be coming back to the group.
The state passed the Pathway to 2050 law on March 26th.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the new law is a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas by 2030. How are we going to get there? I understand transportation takes 50% of our greenhouse gas.
So the question from Pamela Kelly, and thank you, Pamela, for the question, was about the climate legislation that the legislature passed over Governor Baker's veto, right? And that legislation set a commitment for the state to get to net zero on carbon emissions by 2050. That proposal is out there right now, and the various state agencies are in the process of coming up with their different programmatic responses to how we hit those targets and goals. Before I even directly answer Pamela's question, I would also say in this campaign, the first policy proposal that we rolled out was a climate plan that committed to 100% clean electricity by 2030, 100% clean energy by 2040. There are already a dozen states that have a commitment on the books to 100% clean electricity or clean energy. I think that Massachusetts should join those states in making that commitment. And I think from my experience over the last 4+ years, working in clean energy and solar and battery storage, we've seen those technologies take off. And I am convinced that we can be more aggressive than we currently are in existing law. But as Pamela points out, it's not enough to just do the work on electrifying the grid and cleaning up the electricity that goes into it. It's not even enough to switch over from gas and oil and other forms of thermal heat to air source heat pumps and other potential alternatives. We've also got to clean up both our buildings and we've got to clean up the transportation sector. Pamela references 50% as the potential emissions on transportation. I have heard that number anywhere between 35 and 50% of existing greenhouse gas emissions. So how do we do that? The simple truth is, even if the Baker administration signed it into law, they've cut the budget at RTAs. Even with federal funding, they tried to cut the budget at the MBTA. They've cut back service on the commuter rail. So you can't, on the one hand, say you're serious about climate, and on the other hand, not be funding climate solutions like public transit and like non-car-based alternatives for transportation, right? So I don't think there has been a seriousness and a single-mindedness and a focus that we need to have from our governor over the last few years. We've had lip service, we haven't had focus. I will bring focus to this work. One of the provisions in the climate plan that we rolled out is a position above, that would sit above the various secretaries of different agencies whose sole job would be to focus on climate and to make sure that the actions of every secretary of every agency is focused on hitting our goals around climate. So you don't have a Secretary of Housing and Economic Development saying, that's a great housing proposal, but doesn't account for the transportation emissions associated with that housing proposal, or doesn't account for the energy sources that will be used in that housing proposal, right? We want to make sure that we're thinking about climate in every single step that we take. We need to have that coordinating function in state government. You have that coordinating function. I think it helps us start to get at what Pamela outlines. I think the other proposals around fare-free transit leads to increases in ridership. Those increases in ridership are people who aren't in cars, number one, right? The expansion of transit services are alternatives that get people out of cars as well, connect them to economic opportunity, to educational opportunity, to healthcare services, and others. And then finally, yes, there's going to have to be electric vehicles as well. And we'll probably have greater deployment of EVs in Western Mass and Central Mass than we will around Greater Boston. But we need to be clear about the fact that that is an expensive solution. Investments in transit are far more equitable and can get you a far greater use of, or far greater benefit for the use of scarce either ratepayer or taxpayer resources. So EVs are part of the solution, but they can't be our only solution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions caused by the transportation sector. So those are some of the ways that we got there, and we're going to have to be aggressive with all of them if we're serious about 100% clean electricity and clean energy, if we're serious about hitting our targets even under the existing law. Thanks for the question, Pamela.
It was add that we don't talk very much about freight, even though freight transport is very important in the United States. And obviously improving rail lines makes freight transportation more efficient. Improvements on a virtual line just make it faster. East-west, it's true. Coordinating them is tricky. But when we talk about transportation energy emissions or carbon emissions, it's also moving all. You hear about supply chains. It's about getting stuff here that we need and getting things that are made here somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So we need to coordinate that as well.
Up front.
I just wanted to say there was at least 8 people in this room came because we wanted to discuss the PCB dumps with you. Mm-hmm. And I have Alyssa's phone number and email. Yep. We'd like to know if we can coordinate a meeting where you could meet with HRI and our entire group
Happy to do
This
so.
is like a super important thing. We want to remain the gateway to the Berkshires, not the gateway to the dump. It's really super important. Everybody who comes to Pittsfield has to go through Lee. Everyone who comes to Lennox has to go through Lee to get there. So everybody comes to our town, and we do not want to be a dump site.
You have my commitment to the meeting, and I promise you, and I'll make sure you have my contact information as well. Just one, yep, sure.
Can I ask, I would like to send you the geology report, which, you know, most people, I think it's pretty well written. And the main point is, there's a couple of main points about the site that they selected. Number one, about the site that's been selected, it's primarily sand and gravel and cobble. And then there's an aquifer underneath that, so the permeability rate is really fast. So if there's a leak in this supposedly liner that's supposed to stop the contamination from reaching the aquifer, there could be a real problem if there's if there is a leak in there. And the liners aren't warranted. The companies will not warranty them against chemicals. The other thing is that underneath that there's a carbonate bedrock, which, if you know anything about carbonate bedrock, you realize that they often there's caves underneath or voids that if the aquifer becomes polluted, so that the PCBs can wind up right back in the river. And the site that they're proposing doesn't have any PCB contamination, and it's near the state forest.
There's a largest state forest in Massachusetts, I've told them now.
So there's a lot of reasons not to select that site. We were listening to some oral arguments, and something I've been pointing out to everyone right along is that they say less than 50 parts per million, but they're proposing to hydrologically pump it up into these cells. And there's no way you can really control something like that. There's a couple of things like, you know, I'm sure some engineering can come into factor, but I have a feeling that this hydraulic line will get clogged. When it gets clogged, that means that they're going to have to separate it or do something to unclog it. All that material will wind up on the surface land. They say they're going to impact 20 acres, when reality it's probably more like 200 acres by the time you figure out, you know, the travel of the contamination. So it's considered by the geologists a case study of where not to put landfill.
So if you could send the report to, it's ben@ben4mass is my email. That's what comes directly to me, and I'll make sure to read it before our meeting.
And there's other people who
are, I'm sorry, just to be respectful of our last time. We will absolutely have a meeting.
I just wanted to say one more thing. HRI they have a lot more points to cross, but one of the things I do want to bring out, because it was in the oral arguments, the judge said if you have a peanut butter sandwich and you spread out the peanut butter, if you have one speck of peanut butter on one side of the half of the bread and then the rest is all PCBs, is that going to wind up being mixed? And they said yes. So the solution to pollution is dilution. I don't know. I don't think so.
No, thank you. And again, ben@ben4mass. That's the one that comes right to me. Sweet. So yeah, hand right here.
I just have the fare free public transit.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with your plan for it, and I see that, you know, you want to make it a public access. And I think that's a beautiful idea, and I support that. But I noticed that it's going to be funded by taxpayer money and everything. How are you? And taxes rising? Is like certain taxes being allocated to the program?
Yeah. So the question for everyone both out here and everyone in here is how do you fund fare free transit? If you're not collecting fares, you're creating a hole in the operating budget of the regional transit authorities in one form or another. So how would you fund that? So again, the question is, how would you fund fare-free transit? Question is, how would you fund fare-free transit, right? So how would you actually pay? The first proposal on the would be to use funds from the fair share amendment. So next year, when folks go to the ballot, along with voting for who's going to be their governor, their lieutenant governor, treasurer, auditor, you name it, sort of the state election slate. There will also be a ballot initiative that would be a surcharge for folks who make more than $1 million of 4% on any dollar above the $1 million mark that would be paid in to the state. And so it would be using those resources to and prioritizing those resources for fare free transit, a portion of those. If that were to not pass, one of the plans that I will roll out in this campaign is a comprehensive tax reform plan that will ask more, just like Fair Share does, ask more of those who have benefited from economic growth over the last 30 years, the last 40 years, even benefited from economic growth during the pandemic, to pay a little bit more so that we can make sure to fund investments like fare free transit. Now, along with that, that is only one of several initiatives that are proposed here. And that's why I outlined several different potential revenue streams. Regional ballot initiatives would open up revenue streams to local regions to determine if they wanted to move forward with a payroll tax, if they wanted to move forward with a gas tax, a regional sales tax. As just about anyone knows who travels in different parts of the country, in many parts of the country, a county or region has their specific tax to fund their transportation needs in particular, right? They do other things with them as well, but generally regional revenues have been for regional transportation needs. That's one way that we could get at it. But I think you'd use the statewide resources to ensure fare-free transit. You can do that by doubling the RTA budget. You'd probably need to add a little bit above and beyond that as well. Thanks for the question. Appreciate it. I would point out too, it's important to state the reason we have the business model we have right now, the reason that the BRTA, the MBTA, the PVTA, the reason they operate the way they do is because we've held on to the business model that the fare and trolley, or that the electric car service and trolley services had in the late 1800s. We've held on to that when they were private businesses, when our cars were clogged with trolleys and a million different trolley services, right? And we've held on to that and said, well, that's the right way to do it. Well, they're not competing with horses for space on the road anymore, right? Like, we haven't changed the business model from when they were competing with horses on the road. We ought to fund it like the public good that it is, right? And it's true in other things. It's true in childcare, right? We say to childcare providers, because the state hasn't made the investment, you've got to find a way to run this thing like a business. Well, childcare is a broadly shared public good. Even if there's direct benefits to that family, there's a broader benefit to the economy. There's a broader benefit to the economy if we actually invest in transit the way that we ought. So I think that's part of the reason for making that transition and why I think it's so important.
One of the things that I have learned working on trains, and this
Hi. I appear to have lost all of the volume. I don't hear anything on the audio.
And then.
Can you all hear me on the Zoom? Wave your hands and say yes. Make faces at me. I don't see your
I do.
face.
Your forehead.
I don't know.
I had you for a while, but now it's lost again.
Still no sound.
That will allow us to tackle economic, climate change, and work towards racial justice in our communities, in every corner of the community. I do think it's critically important that in all of those, we are flexible. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution across the state. Our regions have different needs. Our communities within those regions have different needs. And we need to make sure that the state, broadly shared state goals allow for a flexibility to meet those goals within them as well.
Will you be taking any campaign finance from GE?
I don't think I have one yet, but I would want to double check to make that. I've made the commitment of no lobbyist donations, no PAC donations, no corporate donations, no fossil fuel donations. So nothing directly from GE. I would want to check and see if there's anything from an employee, but nothing corporate.
Governor Baker gave GE a pass after they polluted, Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut. He gave them nice space in Boston. He ordered them to come tax-free, and I'm sure they don't pay a dime in federal income tax.
We're gonna open it up for questions here in conversation, but we just wanna be respectful of the Zoom people and say farewell to them. So if you both wanna say farewell.
Thanks everyone on Zoom.
Thank you.
And
it's great to have you on.
Can I just ask a quick question?
And I know that there's a couple of good questions on there. And Pamela, I see that one about electricians. Please shoot me an email. We'll follow up there because I got ideas there too.
Stay in touch. Traincampaign.org.
Thank you, everyone.